Hello, New Orleans. JP here. We're going to do something a little different today. Typically, these videos are usually like my own personal research with receipts, explaining to you a complex issue in a way that you can digest and come to your own conclusions, but we're going to do something a little different. This week, there was an excellent story by David Hammer with WWL, link below, and it deals with the JIRR program. Now, what's the JIRR program? That is our roadwork streets program that comes from the funding we received from the federal government after Hurricane Katrina. Now, that was a $1 billion program to do street work. It is the source of all of your frustration and primarily cursing towards the city of New Orleans when you try to drive through your streets uptown and they don't exist anymore. Now, I want to give a brief history, very brief, because David covers it, and I expect all of you will watch the story. But the main issue is the federal government gave us a settlement for all of our street work, and that was done under the Nega administration. Now, the program from its onset was fairly complicated and had a lot of issues to be worked out, and because of that, Nega actually never started it. The JIRR program began in earnest under Mayor Landrieu, where he finally perfected the rules, negotiated, and got it started. Now, Mayor Landrieu did not move as quickly as he could have because he was trying to navigate making sure qualified contractors did qualified work and had outcomes. And the problem with that, though it's a good, is that there is an expiration date on these funds. And so when the Cantrell administration came in, saw the looming expiration date, saw how far behind we were, they basically, under then Ramsey Green, who was the czar of streets and infrastructure, they basically poured gasoline on this thing and just lit it up and said, we're gonna set all the streets on fire and hopefully fix them all. That led to the chaos, which is kind of like the rat maze that is uptown New Orleans and parts of the city of New Orleans and Lakeview. Here's the problem with that. As you guys saw, a lot of unqualified contractors got a lot of money to do a lot of work where they came in over budget, over time, or incomplete. I'm not going to dwell on the train wreck dumpster fire that JIRR is, because that's not the purpose of the story, but it has been kind of a mess. What's important for us today, and what Mr. Hammer covered, was an issue with how we paid for or fronted money for JIRR programs. In his story, he talks about how there was something called essentially express pay, whereas contract work was done, they would submit the receipts and get reimbursed by the state within a reasonable time. I think it was like 10 days or 30 days, whatever. For some reason around 2022, the Cantrell administration stopped doing express pay. And projects started to get payments slower and slower and slower. And then for some reason, in 2024, 2025, as they realized the date to spend money was looming, they decided, and they being DPW, decided, well, rather than restart express pay, we're going to take money out the till, out the general fund, to front pay these projects and then seek reimbursement from the state. Now, let's stop for a second. That is so like batshit stupid that it kind of staggered my brain when I watched David's story. Because one, these are capital projects. We have capital funds that we can't use for general fund that we could use for those projects. So why they didn't go to capital funds first, don't know. Because that would have not led to the tremendous train wreck they created. Instead, they just started paying out the general fund. Now, why is that important? The general fund is the city's cash to pay all our bills. Many of you are familiar with it because we have a cash crunch, which is why we had to go to the state of Louisiana and go through that entire process of getting a revenue anticipation note loan for $125 million. Here's what's interesting. DPW overspent our general fund by $120 million. Let that digest for a second. The people who were in charge of our streets were stealing cash to pay bills and pay salaries to front pay for these road projects. Now, here's what gets really, really extra stupid. They were doing this, and they weren't even chasing the reimbursement timely. There's literally an email exchange in Hammer's story where they said, hey, we spent almost $100 million. We need that reimbursement. Then they send a follow-up email saying, hey, we spent all this money. It's exactly the same letter, except they add one line that's really interesting. They say, we've spent cash, and because we spent this cash, we've created a crisis in the city of New Orleans. In fact, going back to the February 20th meeting where Romy Samuel was attacking us over our ridiculous overspending, there's no mention of JIRR money being taken out of the general fund, creating the cash deficit. In fact, according to Hammer's reporting, the very day, February 20th, where Romy Samuel was taking the council to task over the school board settlement and the council fund as part of our overspending problem, Department of Public Works had already taken $71.4 million out the general fund and told no one, at least not us, about it. I say it's interesting because ultimately the school board settlement hasn't been paid and the council fund was canceled for lack of funding, so we're not contributing to the deficit at all right now. But departments, whether it be NOPD, fire, EMS, other departments running rampant overtime, or when you tally up DPW spending our cash on roads and not getting reimbursement properly, if you just add the general overtime with the cash that was mishandled, $120 million in cash by DPW for these reimbursements they didn't do properly, it's $180 million in cash that disappeared with no record or notice to the council or the public. And I say that because what you should be concerned about is when departments disclose their spending patterns to the council at public meetings, that's how you find out. So when we don't know what they're doing, they're also hiding from you what they're doing. Now, like I said, this is like the most silly, batshit stupid thing I've seen in a while because as they found out later in the year, they started backfilling with capital money they could have spent from the beginning from Jump Street. But as John Oliver would say, what do we do now? Well, the solution to this is the charter amendment. The charter amendment that we have already introduced that's going to go through a public comment period that deals with having a balanced budget and requiring that once a budget is passed, administrations, prospectively, including the Moreno administration, they cannot spend money without that is not in the budget already without having public meetings. What that does is, before overtime can blow through its budget, before we could consider spending more money on overtime as an example, you would have to have a public meeting where the departments would have to say why they missed their overtime numbers and why it's necessary. But on this situation, this JIRR situation, as Mr. Geruso says in the David Hammer story, we never would have approved that. We would have told them, go to the capital funds. We would have intervened at the state or federal level to re-engage the Express program. We would never have permitted them to blow $100+ million in general fund money that takes care of your sanitation, that takes care of your streets, that takes care of the employees of the city of New Orleans to front load a federal program that they still haven't gotten an extension for. There is a path forward to solve these problems, but we have to acknowledge the fact that during the waning years of the Cantrell administration, it appears these departments were like individual duchies in the Game of Thrones, where every single head of each department sees themselves as a lord or a lady that spends money with impunity with little to no oversight. This can never be allowed to happen again, ladies and gentlemen. We have to create a process where transparency and accountability happen on a quarterly or monthly basis when it comes to funding to make sure that if something needs to happen, we all get to weigh in on it, because we're making a lot of hard decisions right now because departments blew through money that we didn't have with little to no oversight. I appreciate Mr. Hammer's reporting. Like I said, I'm not going to sniper wolf this and like talk over his his great coverage, watch it, because he really goes into this in a way that everyone can process. I think we're going to see a lot more stories like this as the Cantrell administration transitions out and we get to find where more bodies are buried, because I know that there's been a lot of frustration by a lot of parties that there have not been really timely responses on public records requests. So with all that, I want you to enjoy the weekend. As you guys know, it is Bayou Classic weekend, and I'm very excited. I love the fact that these two historic institutions come to New Orleans every year to settle old grudges, and I'm here for it. But I just want to say, I mean, I don't have a favorite team in this bowl. I don't have a team that my dad went to Southern. My older brother did some work at Southern. I mean, Southern's in Baton Rouge. I was in Baton Rouge for years. I mean, I don't have a favorite team, and I certainly hope that a team that is in Baton Rouge and New Orleans, have an alumni base in New Orleans, I hope that both teams do a really good job. Enjoy your Bayou Classic weekend, and look forward to seeing you next week. Have a great weekend.